Welcome to the online learning modules for exercise prescription guidelines. This is the first of 4 modules that you will be watching. We ask that you do not look up any other materials in regards to the information that you are about to see. Feel free to take notes throughout if you would like. For more information on the topics covered in this module, please visit the host website of exerciseprescription.web.unc.edu. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this module. This first module is on the American College of Sports Medicine's guidelines for cardiorespiratory training. It is important to note that these modules are focused on the guidelines for sedentary, healthy individuals. All of these guidelines are based on the FITT-VP principle for exercise prescription. Before we go over what the American College of Sports Medicine, or the ACSM, guidelines are for cardiorespiratory training, it is important to understand the FITT-VP principle. All of the ACSM guidelines are based on the FITT-VP principle for exercise prescription, and that is how the modules are laid out. FITT-VP stands for the frequency, intensity, time, type, volume, and progression of exercise. We are going to begin with the first letter of the FITT-VP principle, or the frequency of physical activity. The ACSM defines the frequency of physical activity as the number of days per week dedicated to performing physical activity. As you can see here, the ACSM recommends that sedentary, healthy individuals partake in 5 or more days a week of moderate intensity exercise, or 3 or more days per week of vigorous intensity exercise, or a combination of both moderate and vigorous intensity exercise over the course of 3 to 5 days per week. Now let's talk a little bit more about the recommendations for frequency of cardiorespiratory training and how this applies to the term the weekend athlete. So the weekend athlete is an American term for people that exercise 1 to 2 days per week on the weekend or the days that they are not working. This usually consists of large amounts of cardiorespiratory activity. So you can think of someone going for a 2-hour bike ride on a Saturday and an hour run on a Sunday, for example. And it should be noted that this type of exercise training will elicit positive cardiorespiratory adaptations. Or in other words, it will increase cardiorespiratory function, such as an increase in VO2 max, or a decreased risk of premature mortality or morbidity, just to name a few things. But this type of training is not recommended as the risk of musculoskeletal injury and adverse cardiovascular events are increased because these individuals are unaccustomed to performing exercise of this duration normally. So even though health benefits do occur, it is not recommended that people exercise only 1 to 2 days per week with large amounts of cardio. Now on to the second category of the FITT-VP principle, or the intensity of exercise. In the previous slide, we said that the ACSM recommends moderate and or vigorous exercise 3 to 5 days per week. We can now define what moderate and vigorous mean. So moderate intensity exercise is defined by the ACSM as 40 to 60% of the heart rate reserve, or the HRR. And vigorous intensity exercise is defined by the ACSM as 60 to 90% of the HRR. So the heart rate reserve is the difference between the maximum and resting heart rate. And here, maximum heart rate is calculated using the formula 220 minus a person's age in years. It should be noted that there are many other ways to measure the intensity of exercise, but for simplicity's sake, we will focus on exercise intensity in terms of a percentage of heart rate reserve. The formula used to calculate the heart rate reserve is the max heart rate minus the resting heart rate. And this will give you the heart rate reserve for a person. Let's now look at an example using the heart rate reserve method. You see here we have a 40-year-old male. His resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute, or BPM. His heart rate max is 180 beats per minute, and this was calculated using the formula 220 minus his age of 40. His desired exercise intensity range is 80 to 90% of his heart rate reserve, and the formula used to calculate target heart rate is seen in the middle of the slide. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the heart rate reserve. And we do that by taking his max heart rate of 180 beats per minute and subtracting his resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute. This will give us a heart rate reserve of 120 beats per minute. We then want to convert the desired exercise intensity into a decimal by dividing by 100. So the 80% would be converted into 0.8, and the 90% would turn into 0.9. We can then multiply this by the heart rate reserve. So the 0.8 times the heart rate reserve of 120 beats per minute would equal 96 beats per minute, and the 0.9 times the 120 beats per minute would equal 108 beats per minute. Then we can finally determine the target heart rate range by adding back in the resting heart rate. So the lower limit of his target heart rate range would be the 96 beats per minute we just calculated, plus his resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute, which would equal 156 beats per minute. So if he was exercising at 80% of his heart rate reserve, that would equate to 156 beats per minute. His upper limit would be the 108 beats per minute we calculated before, adding back in his resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute, and that would give us an upper limit of 168 beats per minute, which would correspond to him exercising at 90% of his heart rate reserve. Now that we know the recommendations for intensity and how we can use it in an example using the heart rate reserve method, let's now look at intensity in terms of the overload principle. So first we should go over that there is a positive dose-response relationship between exercise intensity and health and fitness benefits. Or in other terms, a person exercising at 80% of their heart rate reserve will have greater cardiorespiratory adaptations than a person exercising at 40% of their heart rate reserve. This relates to the overload principle, which states that exercise below a certain intensity, or a threshold, will not sufficiently challenge the body enough to elicit physiological changes, such as an increase in VO2 max. This threshold is different for each person and is based not only on a person's cardiorespiratory fitness, but also their age, health status, genetics, and habitual physical activity level. Therefore, there is no one-size-fits-all or exact value for exercise intensity that will improve cardiorespiratory fitness. Another way to think of this is that a highly trained athlete, say a 5,000 meter Olympic runner, would have to train at a much higher intensity, say near maximal or 95% of their heart rate reserve, compared to a recreational runner to improve their VO2 max because their threshold is much higher. Now let's talk about how to incorporate different exercise intensities into a workout. One of the ways to do this is through interval training. Interval training is exercise training in which a person alternates between different exercise intensities for a set amount of time. For example, a person could exercise for 1 minute at a high intensity, or maybe 90% of their heart rate reserve, followed by 2 minutes at a lower intensity, or say 50% of their heart rate reserve. This then could be repeated for a set number of repeats, or say they could do 5 repeats of this 1 minute of high intensity followed by a 2-minute recovery period of a lower intensity exercise. This allows for a person to perform a greater volume of higher intensity exercise over the duration of the workout without taxing the body as much as they would if they performed the same amount of activity continuously. And another form of high intensity interval training is called Tabata training, and that's what's pictured in the table you see in purple to the right. And Tabata is a type of high intensity interval workout developed by a Japanese researcher. The protocol calls for maximal effort burst of activity for 20 seconds followed by a short 10-second recovery. This 20 seconds on, 10-second rest is completed 8 times for a total of 4 minutes of activity, excluding warm-up and cool down. Now let's move on to the time component of the FITT-VP principle. Exercise time, or also called duration, is the amount of time physical activity is performed. The ACSM recommends that a person complete 30 to 60 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per day, or 20 to 60 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise per day. This can be achieved through one continuous exercise session or bouts of 10 or greater minutes over the course of the day. It should be noted that any amount of exercise is better than none. So the ACSM really wants to encourage people to exercise in general, even if they aren't able to meet these recommendations. Now let's move on to the second T of the FITT-VP principle, or the type of cardiorespiratory training. The ACSM recommends that sedentary adults perform rhythmic aerobic exercise involving large muscle groups that requires little skill. Here's a table that gives examples of different cardiorespiratory training exercises. The table was ordered into 4 exercise groups labeled A, B, C, and D. This module focuses on exercise prescription guidelines for healthy sedentary individuals. Therefore, the exercises recommended for Group A, such as walking, leisurely cycling, aqua aerobics, and slow dancing, are great examples of activity that could be performed. This is not an exclusive list of exercises that can be performed. Other aerobic activities that appeal to a person can be performed. It should be noted, however, that the goal is to improve physical fitness and to prevent injuries. Therefore, activities involving a high skill level should be limited the first few weeks to prevent possible injury. This brings up the question of how to determine what type of exercise to do. And it relates directly to the specificity principle that states that the body's responses and adaptations to physical activity is highly related to the mode, frequency, and duration of the physical activity performed. So therefore, a person must determine what their goal is for training and then pick activities that will bring them closer towards that goal. For example, a sprinter is wanting to be very powerful and quick, whereas a marathoner is wanting to be able to have a greater endurance capacity. So the ways that you would train these two people would be quite different. Another thing to consider when determining what type of exercise to do is enjoyment. You should choose an exercise or an activity that you enjoy doing and performing in hopes of making it a habit and something that you look forward to doing. Now let's move on to the V component of the FITT-VP principle, or the volume of cardiorespiratory training. Exercise volume is the product of the frequency, intensity, and time of exercise. The ACSM recommends that a person complete greater than or equal to 500 to 1,000 METs per minute per week, or 1,000 kilocalories per week, or 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise, or greater than or equal to 5,400 to 7,900 steps per day. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about what all of these entail. Now let's go over some of these terms. METs is the amount of oxygen consumed while sitting at rest. 1 MET is equal to around 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. This measures the energy cost of exercise by multiplying by the resting metabolic rate. METs per minute is the product of the number of METs of an activity and the time spent performing the activity. A kilocalorie is the energy required to increase the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And then you see at the bottom the equation to calculate kilocalories per week. Here's a chart of the METs of some common physical activities performed. This information was taken from a larger chart created by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. Moderate activity is defined by the CDC as 3 to 6 METs. It includes activities such as yoga, water aerobics, moderate housework, and walking 3.5 to 4 miles per hour. Vigorous activity is defined as activity greater than 6 METs and includes activities such as running, competitive sports, bicycling greater than 10 miles per hour, and jumping rope. Now let's apply this to an example of a 7 MET activity that was performed for 30 minutes. The 7 MET activity means that a person expends 7 times the energy used by the body at rest. If you take this 7 MET activity and perform it for 30 minutes, you perform 210 METs per minute of physical activity. You find this value by multiplying the number of METs, in this example 7, by the duration of time physical activity was performed. In this example, it was 30 minutes. If a person performed this activity 3 days a week, that would equal 630 METs per minute per week. Or in other words, we took that 210 METs per minute a day and multiplied it by the 3 days per week. Now let's look at another volume example using minutes per week and steps per day. Minutes per week refers to the minutes of physical activity performed in a week. In this example, a person performed 30 minutes of physical activity 5 times per week. The 30 minutes was multiplied by the 5 days to equal 150 minutes per week of physical activity. Another way to track volume is steps per day. The ACSM recommends that a person complete 5,400 to 7,900 steps per day. This can be tracked using a pedometer or using the equivalent of 1 mile equaling around 2,000 steps. Now let's move on to the final volume example. You see here we have a 60 kilogram female. She's running at around 8 METs for 40 minutes, 4 days per week. So first we're going to calculate the MET per minute per week. And we do that by taking the number of METs, which is 8 for her, by the duration of the physical activity of 40 minutes, by the number of times per week she performed this activity, which is 4. So for this female, she was at 1,280 METs per minute per week. Then if we want to calculate the kilocalories per minute, we are going to enter in her information into the formula you see in the middle of your slide. So we enter in the 8 METs and then her body weight of 60 kilograms. And you see here that for this female, she burns 8.4 kilocalories per minute. Then if we want to convert this into kilocalories per week, we take that 8.4 kilocalories per minute, we multiply it by the duration of the activity, 40 minutes, by the number of times per week she performed this activity, which is 4 days, and that's going to equal 1,344 kilocalories per week. Now let's move on to the last letter of the FITT-VP principle, or the progression of cardiorespiratory training. Progression is the gradual increase in exercise frequency, intensity, or duration. Progression of exercise is highly dependent on the individual and how they respond to training. The ACSM recommends increasing exercise duration by 5 to 10 minutes per week every 1 to 2 weeks. After around 1 month of regular exercise training, the frequency, intensity, or time of exercise can gradually increase. It is always important to remember that health is the #1 priority, and therefore it is better to be a little more cautious the first few weeks of beginning an exercise program to prevent injuries and allow the body to adapt to the physiological stresses of exercise. A good key point to remember with progressing exercise is that you do not want to progress 2 different parameters of the FITT-VP principle at once for less fit individuals. For example, it would not be wise for someone that typically runs 30 minutes a day at 8-minute miles to all of a sudden decide to run 60 minutes, so increasing the time or duration a day at 7-minute miles, so also increasing the intensity. That would be increasing the time and the intensity of exercise all at once, which could lead to injury. Here's a summary of the FITT-VP principle for cardiorespiratory training for healthy, sedentary individuals. It should be noted that people unable to meet these minimums can still benefit from some activity. Thank you for watching this first module on the ACSM's guidelines for cardiorespiratory training.